and give us an update on Iran. It's been 2 weeks, and maybe some good news to start off here. One of the most hated people on the show is moving off the talks.
Yeah, yeah. So Richard Nephew, who's virtually a sociopath, he was the deputy. He was essentially the coordinator of sanctions policy under the Obama administration, principal deputy coordinator of sanctions policy. He wrote an infamous book called "The Art of Sanctions," which is all about how he talks about how he used sanctions to just drive up civil unrest in Iran and sabotage economic reforms so that only, the ultra rich would be able to benefit from Iran's economic reforms and drive up inequality and inflation. He talks about how he raised the price of chicken. He tripled the price of chicken to make it prohibitively expensive during important Iranian holidays. He talks about he sabotaged the Iranian automotive industry and making it impossible, hitting manufacturing jobs and things like this, and preventing people from being able to repair their cars. And he celebrates this kind of stuff. He goes, let's see. There's some quotes I have from the Blumenthal article really quick. He just says, during a December 6th, 2017 panel discussion at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, Nephew detailed with a smile how he not only sabotaged Iran's automotive industry, but targeted, quote, things like unemployment to try to drive that up and make things a little more sticky. And, he celebrates, causing all kinds of economic hardship on these people. And I think there's even something in the book where he says that he had traveled to Moscow and lamented how accessible food still was, even under the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. But so he was, bringing him in as the deputy Iran envoy by Biden, when that happened, we covered it, I believe, in March. That was February. That was an extremely provocative move, and signaled that Biden would carry on probably with the maximum pressure campaign, which he has. I mean, really, Iran is the party that has made concessions any concessions at this point by even agreeing to talk with the Americans when, in this a similar environment during Trump, they refused to, hoping that once the Democrats got in power, they would want to return to the JCPOA, since it was Obama's, arguably his, either his greatest or really only achievement at this point. So he's gone. The Wall Street Journal reports that he left after differences of opinion with the negotiating team on Iran. It says that he advocated a tougher posture in the current negotiations. He's no longer on the team, but he's still a State Department employee. And in this Reuters article, we also saw that Ned Price is saying that there's more and more talk coming of as we get closer and closer to a decision period, that the Americans would like to speak directly with the Iranians, which again would be another concession on the part of the Iranians. They're saying that we are prepared to meet directly. We have consistently held the position that it would be much more productive to engage with Iran directly on both JCPOA negotiations and other issues. And that's what Ned Price told, the State Department spokesman told reporters. So just to catch us up on the Iran news, Biden in his presser said that there has been some progress. This was last month. He said that there has been some progress made in the talks in Vienna. He says it's not time to give up. There's still progress being made. And he says that the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Germans, the French, and the British are all on the same page concerning the deal. We also had U.S. officials saying that the usual spin about how Iran's nuclear advancements necessitate that they speed up the negotiating process so that we can reach an agreement before it falls apart at any moment. We had Benny Gantz, the Israeli defense minister, saying that seizing the opportunity of the Houthis responding to the bombing of densely populated cities in Yemen from the Saudis and their coalition when they fired missile strikes on, and of course the Giants Brigade, backed by the UAE, taking territory that they had recently taken during the battle for Marib and the areas around Marib. They fired their the missile strikes on the UAE's oil facilities, the drone and missile attack, and so Gantz sees that opportunity to try and sabotage the JCPOA, of course. He said he blamed Iran for the, quote, terror attack on the United Arab Emirates, and he says that the Vienna talks must take into account Iran's proxies, and that, basically painting them as the big villain in the region responsible for everything that goes wrong. And the Israeli Prime Minister's office, Naftali Bennett's office, put out a statement saying the goal should be to hit the Iranian regime and its emissaries in the region. The Americans and the Europeans last month were saying that it's a mere matter of weeks before the talks reach a point where they are declared a failure. We had Anthony Blinken come out and say that this is the decisive moment for the talks. But of course, as Jason Ditz notes here, the Iranians have previously said that when the Americans and the Europeans say these things, they're just artificial deadlines and they don't take them very seriously. Or that they won't be pressured with this kind of rhetoric, which they've been doing virtually since talks restarted at the end of November. Now, Robert Malley came out and said they were a couple weeks ago, they were making a big deal about how there are 4 Iranian American prisoners in Iran still. They're mostly in they're like 50s, 60s, they're in their 50s or their 60s or their 80s. And there's 4 of them, and so so there was kind of a controversy about this a couple weeks ago, and Robert Malley, the envoy for Iran, had suggested that it's possible that they may not reach a deal unless these prisoners are released. Excuse me. So he says, they're separate, but we're pursuing both of them. But I will say it's very hard for us to imagine getting back into the nuclear deal while 4 innocent Americans are being held hostage by Iran. So we're conducting talks with Iran indirectly on the nuclear file. Let's see. We're conducting talks with Iran indirectly on the nuclear file. We are conducting, again, indirectly discussions with them to ensure the release of our hostages. And, even using the word hostages, I think, is trying to evoke the imagery of the embassy crisis in 1979. These kinds of things have always been separate from the nuclear deal negotiations. As Dave DeCamp notes here, the U.S. and Iran even agreed to prisoner swaps during the Trump years. Now, Dave also suggests that they may use this as an excuse to say that the deal just can't work, and just use that as their excuse for not lifting sanctions on Iran. But I picked up a note from Middle East Eye on an article about them reaching direct talks in the case if Iran's saying that they will consider having direct talks. It's not something that they would refuse if that's what it takes to reach a good deal. And there's a quote in here from first of all, I'll just say that the as they say here, the 4 U.S. citizens include Iranian American businessman Siamak Namazi. He's 50, and his father Bakir Namazi. He's 85. Both of whom were convicted of collaboration with a hostile government. Siamak remains in prison while his father was released on medical grounds in 2018, but he's not allowed to leave the country. The 2 other U.S. citizens are an environmentalist named Morad Takhbaz, who's 66, and a businessman named Imad Shargri, who's 57. Now, Saeed Khatizbeh, the foreign ministry spokesman, said that it is possible to reach an agreement on both the release of Iranian and U.S. prisoners and the nuclear deal. He said they are 2 different paths, but if the other party, the U.S., has the determination, there is the possibility that we reach a reliable and lasting agreement in both of them in the shortest time. So I just noticed, unfortunately, there were other reports that I was reading about this same issue that weren't including that quote. And so I just wanted to make sure that we highlight that even if the Americans, although I haven't heard much about this story in the weeks since, but if they do try and use that as the excuse, people should know that the Iranians have already said that they could absolutely come to an agreement on that issue.
And just to highlight that is a real concession, because I do know initially the Iranians responded to that by saying that, that there won't be any more tack-on deals, which kind of made sense, right? The U.S. left this agreement, and so from the Iranian perspective, if they make concessions, then it's rewarding the Americans for leaving the agreement. And so, to be even willing to consider that, I think is somewhat significant. There was a meeting between Putin and Rossi this week. That's pretty important.
Yeah, this was actually last month. I think this was around sort of the 20th.
Right.
In the 21st. Yeah. And they said basically I mean, it appears that this is the first visit in 5 years between the Iranian and Russian leaders. Raisi visited Moscow, and he also brought his oil and economic ministers with him. They both sides supported improving their bilateral ties. Putin and Raisi had a 3-hour meeting. They talked about regional and international issues. Now the oil and economic ministers said that their talks with their Russian counterparts exceeded expectations, and that agreements were made in trade, energy, transportation, and banking sectors, and they've promised results will be felt in the foreseeable future. They talk about how there's a record figure last year of Iranian and Russian bilateral trade. It exceeded $3.5 billion. They haven't finalized it, but they're working on this new and improved 20-year cooperation agreement. Raisi brought when he went to Moscow, he brought a proposed draft. There was some speculation at the time this report came out that the Russians might consider sending them the S-400 air defense systems and the Su-35 fighter jets that they've wanted for years, that Russia has always said no to, or at least for the last, they've always, for years they've been denying this request, because Russia has a very, they don't really take too many, they really are out for their own interests in the region, and I think they have a pretty good relationship with Israel and some of Iran's putative enemies, even though, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are getting, starting to really warm ties, or at least especially Saudi Arabia is with Iran, at least right now. And we've also seen other moves from the UAE, of course, as well. But I think that they talk in here about how that would that sale could potentially jeopardize, Russia's standing in the region and their alliances and not alliances, but their friendships. And so that does not really come to fruition at all. However, they say that doesn't mean that they're disinterested in enhancing their military cooperation, and they reference the trilateral naval drill that was recently held with China, Iran, and Russia in the Gulf of Oman. Now, let's see. So the most important thing I thought, as far as the regional sort of Middle East diplomacy here with the meetings with the Russians, is that Putin expressed his support for Iran to have a free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union. That's Armenia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, along with Russia. And he wants them to set up a free trade zone with Iran. Now, Russia they're saying is also wants to increasingly get involved as a mediating partner in sort of Middle East diplomacy, and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, wants to organize a conference to resolve regional issues through talks, and he actually says, he describes it as, quote, a conference that would bring Iranians and Arabs together where Iran would not be the subject of discussion, and where each side would lay their concerns on the table and would address issues with Yemen, Syria, and Iraq as well. So that could be a positive sign, because as we'll get, further in here, there's even we're starting to see some, in our Yemen coverage, there's starting to be some rifts even between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia about what the future policy in somewhere like Yemen should be. Now, the more recent Iran news, we have Brett McGurk, the head of he's the top Middle East official on the National Security Council. He's saying now that we're in the ballpark of a possible deal. He doesn't really elaborate further, as Dave says here, but he says that there's Dave DeCamp at Antiwar.com, but he says there's a very real chance the talks could collapse soon. But what I think is also important is that he quotes here Mikhail Ulyanov, who's the Russian envoy in Vienna, who says that actually a deal could be reached by the end of the month. He says, quote, if the talks continue at the pace they're currently going, in principle, it's quite realistic to reach agreement by the end of February. And I also sent a tweet from Ulyanov where he actually says he's talking Richard. He's quote tweeting a guy who's just being hawkish here from the FDD. and they're talking about Blinken visiting the UAE, and he's sort of blaming, uh, he's blaming the again, like we said with the Israelis, blaming Iran for the Houthis retaliating against the attacks on their country from the United Arab Emirates. But Ulyanov points out here that they absolutely support Iran's demand for guarantees against, the U.S. doing what they did in 2018 and unilaterally and illegally reimposing sanctions and leaving the deal. So I think that's something to keep in mind as we move forward and get closer and closer to, the crunch period here where decisions are made. As they keep saying, tough political decisions have to be made. That's sort of the recurring rhetoric actually from all sides in these negotiations in Vienna. But I think, again, it's subjective, as we'll see. The Americans, I mean, everybody's basically, except for the Americans, saying that tough decisions have to be made on all sides. But the Americans are sort of painting this picture for the most part where it's like the Iranians are the ones who are going to have to make tough decisions. And that could mean, accepting a very bad deal. That's always the case, especially with the American history with the JCPOA. So now Ulyanov said that there's another article here where last week the talks went on pause on Friday. The representatives traveled back to their respective capitals for further consultations with their governments. To my knowledge, the talks have not restarted yet, but they're supposed to this week. Ulyanov again said that, he said the participants in the Vienna talks will take a break, not very long. He says that the negotiations have reached at the advanced stage. Political decisions are needed. The Europeans, the British, the French, and the Germans put out a joint statement that says January has been the most intensive period of these talks to date. Everyone knows we are reaching the final stage, which requires political decisions. Let's see. Now, the other thing I picked up here from antiwar.com is that Iran has closed up the Karaj site up near just outside of Tehran. This is the site we covered for a while where the Israelis had sabotaged it with a drone and blown up. Actually, they put a hole in the roof and there had to be a replacement. And this was concurrent with an Israeli military delegation visiting Washington, D.C. And the subject of their talks was Iran. So it was pretty provocative and pretty, blatant. What would happen. So now the this went on for months. There were disputes over the monitoring agreement with the IAEA, and the Iranians ultimately got the IAEA to condemn the Israeli sabotage attack, even though it took them months. They said, we won't let you replace the cameras until you do so. And when they did, they allowed them to get in there and they reset the cameras and everything. But now they're moving the facility south. They shuttered the whole thing and moved the camera. The IAEA has installed cameras in a new facility in Esfahan, which is further south in central Iran. So Jason suggests here that this could be the Iranians have not really explained this move, although they're not required to. But he suggests that it could be security concerns for potential Israeli attacks, that they just want to move this centrifuge workshop here somewhere further away from Tehran. Now, Saeed Khatibzadeh is saying that he's the foreign ministry spokesman. He's saying that there are still significant issues preventing a deal from being reached. He says important and significant issues remain regarding the removal of sanctions and that have not made an agreement possible so far. And he reiterated his calls for the guarantees that the U.S. won't leave the deal again. He said there's still very significant progress being made during these last 3 weeks of negotiations. And as Dave DeCamp reports here, participants on all sides are saying, like I said, that these political decisions need to be made here soon. Khatibzadeh says the other parties know the differences clearly. They need to make their political decisions, especially in Washington. And he says, we await decisions by Washington upon the return of the U.S. delegation. Now, there was a piece in Reuters yesterday where a senior U.S. State Department official said that we are, in fact, in the final stretch of negotiations. Now, this one is a little bit more I'm a little ambivalent about this report because they say that the latest talks, he says as well that the latest talks in Vienna are among the most intensive we had to date. He says we've made progress narrowing down on the differences just to the key priorities on all sides, and that's why now it is the time for political decisions. And I think that's really a credit to the Iranians for sticking to their guns and being steadfast and demanding, full sanctions relief and a full, thorough implementation of the JCPOA, not what Obama did, which was very dishonest, where he didn't provide sanctions relief and didn't follow through on the deal and even impose sanctions the day it was signed. And they want those guarantees and the verification mechanism and the time period. There is also a debate over how long that verification period should be before Iran starts rolling back their nuclear advancements. And I think they're right to demand, obviously, an extended period, or at least more so than what the Americans are saying. Because I think the Americans said, and we talked about it here before, that, it should only take a few days or whatever. But they need to know, because once they roll that back, they're rolling back all the leverage they have in talks. So that could be very, very precarious. Now, this official says now is the time for Iran to decide. Oh, he says the Americans have already laid out what they're prepared to do in terms of lifting sanctions that are inconsistent with the nuclear deal, which that's a phrase that has been used many times by the Americans, and it's very sort of in the eyes of the beholder. What the Americans think is inconsistent with the deal. I'm sure the Americans think that Obama implemented the JCPOA in a manner consistent with the deal, but that's certainly not true, and that's what the Iranians are talking about. That they want all sanctions lifted, all Trump era sanctions lifted, and actually they want the deal to be implemented. They want all the sanctions agreed to be lifted in the deal lifted, which didn't even has never happened. And they weren't able to reap the economic benefits that they should have already received from having the deal and being able to open up their economy. But he sort of paints it as, he says that ball is in Tehran's court, and now is the time for them to decide if they're prepared to make the decisions necessary for a mutual return to compliance. And he says in the event that doesn't happen, we will step up the pressure, economic, diplomatic, and otherwise. And the otherwise is, of course, a hint at military action. Now, I did get this latest report from the antiwar.com newswire about a piece in the New York Times. This is written up by Dave DeCamp, and he says that a senior State Department official told reporters yesterday, that if Iran is willing to make the necessary decisions quickly, the U.S. can see a path to the deal. They talk about sort of the political pressure that Biden would face in returning the deal from hawkish Democrats and certainly almost all the Republicans. And they do say that they say he's willing to, quote, make the political decisions necessary to achieve that goal. So that could be a very good sign. But as I said, there's a lot of, it's sort of ambiguous at this point. We have to get a little bit further to see what's going to happen, because as I say, the Americans could give the Iranians a lousy deal and still think they're being very generous given the history.
All right, Connor. Thanks for the update on Iran, Tots.